December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. America enters World War II. Within 6 weeks, the United States military will face a crisis more devastating than any naval defeat. A crisis that threatens to paralyze every tank, truck, aircraft, and landing craft in the American arsenal. Japan has captured 97% of the world's natural rubber supply. Without rubber, the American war machine cannot move, cannot fly, cannot fight. Military planners estimate 18 months until complete operational collapse. The countdown has begun. What nobody knows is that the solution already exists. Locked away in a laboratory notebook belonging to a chemist whose colleagues mocked his experiments as worthless, whose methods were dismissed as stupid, whose materials were considered industrial garbage. In Washington, panic spreads behind closed doors. Engineers warn that even boots for infantry will run out. Tires for trucks, gone. Landing gear for bombers, useless. Gaskets, hoses, fuel lines, all rubber, all irreplaceable. America may have soldiers, guns, factories, and steel, but without rubber, it is a giant with no legs. The government launches emergency committees, telegrams fly across every industrial office in the nation, and generals quietly begin calculating which divisions will die first when supply lines fail. And all the while, far from the halls of power, in a forgotten corner of a research facility, a mild-mannered chemist works alone with a pile of leftover chemicals no one wanted, unaware that the future of the entire U.S. Army may hinge on his ridiculous experiments. History remembers the soldiers on the battlefield, but sometimes the war is saved long before a bullet is fired, by a man no one ever thought mattered. By the way, before we go deeper into this unbelievable true story, where are you watching this video from? Drop your country in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story travels. And if you enjoy hidden Wuti stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming episodes. The crisis hit faster than anyone expected. By early 1942, the U.S. was burning through its remaining rubber stockpile at a terrifying rate. Every new Jeep sent overseas was another nail in the coffin of the supply chain. Every training flight meant another set of tires worn down. Factory equipment itself needed rubber seals and belts to keep running, meaning even production would eventually grind to a halt. This was not just a battlefield problem. It was a national survival countdown. Newspapers never printed the reality. America was weeks away from rationing rubber the same way it rationed bread. Behind closed doors, the U.S. government declared what historians would later call the hidden crisis. The single greatest logistical threat of the entire war. The enemy wasn't bullets, tanks, or bombs. It was time. Scouts were dispatched to South America to search for native rubber trees. Nothing workable. Other chemists tried boiling plant fibers. Total failure. Some even tried stretching existing rubber further by cutting quality, which only made aircraft blow tires more often. Eventually, the War Production Board delivered the grim truth. If a miracle didn't appear soon, the Allied war effort would collapse before it truly began. Deep in the research labs of B.F. Goodrich, there was one man who refused to accept collapse. Dr. Waldo Seaman. To most industrial chemists, he was a curiosity, an eccentric tinkerer obsessed with turning useless byproducts into something new. To them, it was pointless. To him, it was possibility. Years earlier, while experimenting with unwanted waste materials, Seaman had stumbled onto a rubber-like polymer. But at the time, no one cared. The nation still had abundant supplies of natural rubber. So his discovery sat ignored, collecting dust in a notebook. Until now. When the War Department began begging every corporation for solutions, Goodrich quietly submitted his name. The response from government scientists was lukewarm at best. Unproven, unsuitable, not scalable. They couldn't even imagine rubber that didn't come from a tree. But Seaman didn't give up. Day after day, night after night, he went back to the lab, not with glory in mind, but with obsession. He believed synthetic rubber was possible. Not a cheap imitation, but a replacement superior to anything nature could make. The scale of his challenge was unbelievable. Rubber wasn't just stretchy. It had to withstand heat, freezing, tension, oil exposure, bending, the abuse of tanks, rifles, planes, and weather. Nature had perfected it over millions of years. Seaman had one war to do the same, and his earliest attempts? Catastrophes, samples melted under heat, others shattered in the cold, some crumbled like chalk in a soldier's hand. One batch literally dissolved when exposed to gasoline. Colleagues laughed and joked that he was making rubber from trash. Engineers mocked the idea a polymer could save the army. But for Seaman, the failures weren't humiliations. They were clues. If this polymer broke in the cold, change its chain structure. If gasoline dissolved it, reinforce its molecular bonds. If tension snapped it, make the backbone more elastic. He wasn't guessing. He was learning. Outside the lab, generals were panicking. Inside the lab, one man was quietly evolving into the only reason the war might be winnable. The rubber supply clock kept ticking down. Factories waited. Tanks waited. Commanders waited. And in a tiny, windowless room filled with fumes, notebooks, and stubborn hope, Waldo Seaman began to push an impossible idea toward existence. By the spring of 1942, the situation had reached a breaking point. Generals demanded answers. Industry demanded a formula. And the War Production Board began quietly drafting the nightmare contingency plan. Which parts of the military would be shut down first once the last tires and hoses ran dry? The Navy would suffer first. Shipyards needed thousands of rubber seals per week. Then the Army. No transport trucks meant no supplies. Finally, the Air Corps. Because a bomber grounded in California was as useless as scrap metal. America had the soldiers. America had the steel. America had the firepower. But without rubber, it had no movement. Meanwhile, in that small laboratory, Waldo Seaman had crossed a threshold, not with a perfect material yet, but with consistency. His test batches were no longer total failures. Some held shape, some stretched correctly, some resisted gasoline. The parts were there, but he needed to combine them into a single breakthrough. He could feel it. He was close. One late night, the kind of night where chemists forget time exists, he changed the ratio of a stabilizing compound almost by instinct, chasing a hunch no textbook would ever justify. He set the mixture to cure overnight, packed his notes, and went home unsure whether he was wasting his life or saving a war. The next morning he tested the sample. It didn't crack. It didn't melt. It didn't dissolve. It didn't tear. It behaved like rubber. But this time, better. He stretched it. It snapped back perfectly. He exposed it to fuel. It remained solid. He chilled it. It stayed flexible. One of his assistants, stunned, whispered, "Doctor, what did you do?" Seaman didn't answer. He just stared at the material in his hands, realizing that this wasn't just a laboratory curiosity anymore. This was scalable. This could replace every drop of natural rubber America had lost. But a chemist's breakthrough is only the beginning. Now came the real test. Convincing the government and the factories that this trash rubber could save the army. The demonstration was arranged in absolute secrecy. If news leaked and failed, morale would collapse across the nation. Generals, scientists, and industry leaders stood shoulder to shoulder in a locked testing facility, arms folded, braced for disappointment. They gave Seaman the toughest challenge possible. They mounted his sample on industrial rollers and blasted them with friction. They bent, flexed, froze, and boiled it. A military mechanic soaked it in fuel. Another tried to split it. An engineer twisted it to the breaking point. It refused to fail. A silence fell. Not surprise, disbelief. Then came the sentence that changed the course of American industry. This is war ready. The government didn't walk out of that room. They ran. Phone lines lit up. Emergency funding was authorized overnight. Factories were ordered to retool instantly for mass production. Entire assembly lines ripped out and rebuilt for a material no soldier had ever seen, but would soon depend on with his life. Synthetic rubber wasn't a backup plan. It was now the only plan. And just like that, from a mocked experiment born in a forgotten lab, an invisible lifeline had appeared for millions of American troops. But the public still didn't know. The soldiers still didn't know. The world still didn't know. They were about to find out. Not in a laboratory, but on the battlefield. The first battlefield test of synthetic rubber wasn't announced, wasn't publicized, and wasn't even acknowledged in official reports. It simply appeared, inside supply trucks rolling toward the Pacific front. The men driving them had no idea that the tires they trusted with their lives were not natural rubber at all. They just knew they held. Convoys traveled longer. Maintenance failures dropped. Landing craft that once tore gaskets after every surf hit now stayed seaworthy. Army engineers didn't believe it at first. They thought it was coincidence. Then the real test came. In North Africa, American troops were preparing for extended operations across brutal terrain. Jagged rocks, blowing sand, extreme temperatures. That environment destroyed natural rubber. Tires shredded, hoses split, boots cracked. If synthetic rubber was going to fail anywhere, it would fail here. But it didn't. Fuel lines that once burst under midday heat stayed intact. Truck tires lasted twice as long. Shock absorbers on troop carriers remained stable. Tank tread components endured the desert furnace without breaking down. Only then did the army begin to realize what they were actually holding. Not a replacement, an upgrade. The war machine had been saved not by a general, not by a secret weapon, not by a battlefield genius, but by a quiet chemist no one believed in. While combat units pushed deeper through enemy territory, new factories back home roared to life. Thousands of workers poured synthetic rubber into molds around the clock. Wheels for jeeps, hoses for Shermans, boots for infantry, gaskets for engines, seals for aircraft landing gear. In less than 6 months, the United States had gone from the edge of collapse to the largest rubber-producing power in human history. For Japan, it was an economic ambush they never saw coming. They had believed stealing the plantations meant crippling America permanently. Instead, their strategy triggered the birth of an industry nature itself couldn't keep up with. And now, every mile a truck could travel, every bombing mission a plane could survive, every landing craft that could push through a storm, all of it, traced back to a man they had once mocked. But here's the twist most people don't realize. Millions of soldiers never knew the war had almost ended before they even reached the front. They never knew that tanks rolling through Africa, landing craft preparing for Europe, or bombers flying over the Pacific were on the verge of dying stillborn. Choked out by a lack of rubber, all they saw was movement. All they saw was strength. But it was synthetic courage keeping them moving. Before I continue, quick question to you watching. Where are you watching this video from? I love seeing how far these forgotten stories travel across the world. And if you're enjoying this incredible hidden chapter of Waidu history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this one. We have some shocking ones coming, because now, the war is about to shift from survival to momentum. And that single discovery is about to make possible one of the most daring operations in modern warfare. The story is only just entering the battlefield. By late 1942, the effects of synthetic rubber were no longer confined to labs or supply depots. They were transforming the rhythm of the entire Allied war machine. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the US military wasn't calculating losses. It was planning expansion. New factories no longer feared breakdowns. Ammunition trucks no longer stalled in the desert. Aircraft maintenance teams suddenly had replacements instead of apologies. And the enemy noticed. Japanese intelligence began intercepting reports that American logistics had not collapsed as expected. The empire had captured the plantations, the trees, the ports, everything nature could provide. Yet the Americans fought on as if rubber had become infinite, because now, it was. Inside the War Department, synthetic production surged past 1 million tons per year, an unimaginable figure before the war. Government officials called it an industrial miracle, but they still didn't know the full story. Most didn't even know Siemens' name. The credit was filed under corporate memos, defense contracts, and code names. The man who made the miracle possible remained a footnote. Meanwhile, on the front lines, synthetic rubber began rewriting tactics. Trucks could push deeper into rugged terrain without waiting for spare tires flown in from distant depots. Armored units had more reliable shock absorption, meaning tanks could fire accurately while moving, a massive advantage in mobile warfare. Aircraft no longer suffered catastrophic tire blowouts on rough airstrips. Gas masks, once fragile and prone to cracking, became dependable. Logistics didn't just survive. Logistics accelerated. That acceleration would prove decisive when the Allies prepared for their first massive test of global projection. D-Day, the Normandy invasion, required the single largest coordinated movement of men, fuel, weapons, and vehicles in world history. Every landing craft, every jeep, every truck rolling off those beaches depended on components that should not have existed, because the plantations in Malaya and Indochina were in enemy hands. But they didn't need them anymore. Rubber wasn't traveling from Southeast Asia. It was coming straight from American factories. Generals understood exactly what this meant. The United States could now fight a long war, and win it if Japan had successfully choked off rubber. The US Army would have stalled before ever reaching Europe. Tanks would never have crossed North Africa. Airfields would have shut down one runway at a time. D-Day would have been a fantasy. Instead, synthetic rubber became the quiet bridge between industrial might and battlefield dominance. For the soldiers, synthetic rubber wasn't a chemical breakthrough. It was motion. It was momentum. It was continuation, the difference between a fighting army and a grounded one. But for the man who made it happen, there was no parade, no medal, no national speech. While generals became legends and battles became history, Semin went back to his notebooks, improving formulas while armies marched across continents because of him, unknowingly carried by his invention. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Allies were no longer merely responding to the war, They were driving it forward. The balance had shifted. A single crazy rubber experiment had just bought America the most valuable weapon any nation can possess in wartime. Time. Time to build. Time to mobilize. Time to prepare the greatest invasion the modern world had ever seen. And that invasion was now getting closer. To understand how critical synthetic rubber became, you have to picture the moment it truly faced its ultimate test. June 1944. The Normandy landings. This wasn't just a battle. It was the turning point of the entire war. If D-Day failed, the Allies would not get a second chance. Every nation behind the operation understood the stakes. Break into Fortress Europe, or spend years watching Nazi Germany tighten its grip. But behind the heroism of the beaches was something the average soldier never saw. Over 20,000 vehicles that had to roll onto wet sand. Rocks, mud, shingle, and broken steel obstacles without failing. Not for minutes, not for hours, for days. Before synthetic rubber, this would have been impossible. Landing craft slammed against waves hard enough to tear natural rubber seals apart. Tanks weighed so much that standard tires and treads deformed under stress. The cold of the English Channel could make ordinary rubber brittle. And once ashore, shrapnel, broken metal, and jagged terrain could shred underbuilt tires instantly. But the rubber holding those landing craft together wasn't natural anymore. The seals weren't harvested. They were engineered. The treads weren't grown. They were built. The entire invasion rested on a material that did not exist 3 years earlier. Imagine the first wave of troops. Engines roaring, waves crashing, every soldier bracing for gunfire. All of them assuming the only threat was German bullets. But their movement, their very ability to reach the fight, depended on synthetic rubber quietly doing its job under unimaginable stress. When the ramps dropped and tanks rolled forward through seawater, it wasn't just steel and armor entering the war. It was a chemical breakthrough from an unknown laboratory. Every landing craft that returned for another trip, still watertight. Every troop truck that clawed its way off the beach, still rolling. Every piece of support machinery that survived shrapnel exposure, still intact. Historians focus on Omaha Beach, the smoke, the fire, the heroism. But look just a layer deeper, and you see another truth. Without Siemens rubber, Omaha Beach becomes Omaha Cemetery. Because a landing craft that can't return for reinforcements? A tank whose treads snap under load? A truck that can't move ammunition forward? That is a defeated invasion before the shooting even starts. When people say D-Day was a miracle, they're only half right. The miracle happened before the beach. Synthetic rubber didn't win D-Day alone, but without it, there would be no D-Day to win. The German High Command never understood how the Americans recovered so fast. They assumed secret trading, smuggling, hidden plantations, anything except a complete reinvention of the material itself. While German intelligence officers searched the Pacific for stolen rubber shipments, American scientists were making tons of it by sunrise. This is the moment synthetic rubber stopped being a scientific achievement and became a strategic weapon. The soldiers on the sand became heroes. The commanders in the bunkers became legends. But in a silent laboratory thousands of miles away, one man had loaded the first invisible artillery shell that made the invasion even possible. And after Normandy, the war would begin accelerating toward its final reckoning. D-Day proved the power of synthetic rubber on a global stage. But what most people don't realize is that this innovation didn't just support the war. It changed the psychology of the war. Before Normandy, the Allied strategy was survival. After Normandy, it became momentum. The machine could finally keep moving. Armies could now stay supplied. And when an army never stops moving, it never stops winning. This is where the story widens beyond chemistry, into legacy, faith, and the strange idea that sometimes the fate of millions rests not on muscle or rank, but on a single unseen mind refusing to quit when everyone else gave up. Ask yourself this: how many inventions in history have saved an army before a single shot was even fired? Most people credit Eisenhower, Patton, MacArthur, the generals who shaped the battlefield. But none of them could have lifted a single division off the shoreline without the rubber holding every machine together. And here's the twist most documentaries never mention. At no point during the war did the United States publicly tell soldiers they were using synthetic rubber. Not once. No newsreel announced it. No speech revealed it. No medal ceremony honored it. Millions of men placed their lives in the hands of a technology they didn't even know existed. That's why this moment in the story is so powerful, because it forces us to confront a deeper truth. Heroes don't always stand on the battlefield. Sometimes they stand in silence. Sometimes they wear a lab coat instead of a helmet. Sometimes the man who saves a soldier's life never meets him, never knows his name, and never receives his thanks. Think about that. How many times in your own life have you been saved by someone you never met? How many things you rely on daily exist because someone invisible fought quietly for them to exist? Most people watching this video know the battles, Omaha Beach, Midway, North Africa, but almost nobody knows who enabled them. And that's what makes this story so different. Because without synthetic rubber, 500,000 men don't even reach Normandy. Without synthetic rubber, supply trucks don't reach the Ardennes. Without synthetic rubber, fuel lines rupture in freezing mud during the Battle of the Bulge. Without synthetic rubber, tanks become statues, planes become shelters, trucks become abandoned steel. Without synthetic rubber, America loses the war before momentum ever begins. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cheered on by crowds. But it was decisive. Before I continue, let me ask you directly, because I'm genuinely curious. If history had forgotten your contribution, but your work saved millions, would that be enough for you? Would you still push through the ridicule, the doubt, the failure, knowing you might never be thanked? Most people chase recognition. Waldo Seaman chased results, and he won. But the war wasn't over. The breakthrough was only part of the story. The real impact was still coming, because synthetic rubber wasn't just enabling mobility. It was about to enable victory. The quiet chemist miracle was now powering an army that would not stop, in Europe, in the Pacific, across oceans and continents. And soon the enemy would feel the full weight of a war machine no longer held together by nature, but by human invention. The deeper the war pushed into the Pacific, the more brutal and unforgiving the combat became. It wasn't glamorous like Hollywood posters. The jungle didn't care how brave a soldier was. It cared whether he could survive humidity, rot, disease, mud, and terrain designed to swallow men whole. And this is where the rubber war proved itself not as a backup plan, but as a silent weapon. From 1942 onward, U.S. Marines were pushing through islands where everything was trying to kill them. Enemy machine guns, malaria mosquitoes, fungal infections, soaked uniforms that never dried, rusted metal, trench foot waiting for one bad step. In those months, the first batches of synthetic rubber gear arrived. Nobody in the press noticed. It didn't get newspaper headlines. It didn't get parades. But to the men wading through knee-deep swamp water in places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Bougainville, it was salvation. Boot soles no longer dissolved after 3 weeks like they did with rationed natural rubber. Vehicle tires could now handle coral, volcanic rock, and jagged jungle terrain without peeling apart. Truck convoys didn't need to halt for shortages. They could move supplies faster than the Japanese could blow them up. Even blood transfusion lines and medical tubing in frontline field hospitals, all synthetic. A wounded Marine's chance of surviving his second hour after being shot skyrocketed because rubber tubing didn't crack, crumble, or jam at the worst possible moment. No one would ever call it heroism, but without it, heroism would have died in those swamps before anyone pulled a trigger. On Tarawa, during the amphibious landings in 1943, entire waves of Marines made it ashore only because their inflatable landing craft didn't leak. Japanese artillery hit them hard, splintering wood and metal, but the synthetic rubber bladders held long enough for the men to crawl onto the reef and keep advancing. One failed gasket, one cracked seal, that could have doomed hundreds. Instead, thousands lived because a chemist in a quiet lab back home had worked out the impossible formula. That was the thing. The rubber war didn't feel like war. It felt like plumbing, manufacturing, math, testing, a chalkboard full of molecules, Bunsen burners and beakers. Completely boring until it was strapped to a soldier's boot, a pilot's tire, or a medic's oxygen hose on a battlefield where failure wasn't inconvenient. It was final, but the industrial scale was staggering. American factories, Detroit, Akron, Chicago, ran 24 hours a day, 90 different production lines. Women who had never set foot in a plant were now mixing polymer compounds and cutting treads for bomber tires. The U.S. wasn't just fighting the war, it was out-manufacturing death itself. The Japanese high command never saw it coming. They believed controlling the plantations meant controlling the future. They assumed the U.S. would collapse slowly, strangled not by bullets, but by shortages. But synthetic rubber turned scarcity into surplus, and surplus turned into momentum. Every month, American output climbed. By 1944, the U.S. wasn't just replacing natural rubber. It was outproducing the entire world's pre-war rubber supply combined. This quiet miracle rippled outward. More landing craft, more Marines landed, faster island captures, shorter campaigns, fewer casualties. That's how a boring chemical breakthrough becomes a battlefield victory. No medal ceremonies, no thunderous speeches. Just science becoming logistics, and logistics becoming survival. When Marines later wrote home about Guadalcanal or Bougainville, they talked about courage, fear, and the enemy. But buried in every one of those stories was a hidden detail. A soldier made it home because his gear didn't fail, because his boots didn't fall apart, because the wheels kept turning, because rubber, synthetic rubber, never gave up on him. In a war of bullets, bombs, and bravery, sometimes the most important weapon wasn't a gun. It was chemistry. By 1944, the Axis still didn't understand what had happened. They kept counting ships, counting tanks, counting guns, but they never counted rubber. They couldn't see the invisible advantage woven into every American advance. They saw Marines on beaches, not the supply chain beneath their boots. They saw aircraft bombing their positions, not the synthetic tires that survived brutal landings on cracked, improvised runways. They saw replacement troops arriving every week, never realizing the only reason replacements could arrive so fast was because the entire U.S. Army had become mobile, flexible, unstoppable. The United States had pulled off something nearly impossible in wartime. It had eliminated a critical weakness before it collapsed the front lines. Japan struck, hoping to cut oxygen from the lungs of U.S. industry. Instead, they accidentally strengthened it. America now had something even colonial empires never achieved: rubber independence. Rubber was no longer a resource tied to geography. It was now a resource tied to innovation. Factories didn't wait for harvest seasons. They didn't rely on shipping routes vulnerable to submarines. They didn't bow to climate or theft or sabotage. They ran because chemistry was now the plantation, and laboratories were the orchards. In a war of months, that meant survival. In a war of years, that meant dominance. Troops didn't see polymer chains or catalysts, but they felt the difference in every unglamorous moment of war. When their fuel trucks started every morning rather than rotting in a jungle. Lot. When ambulance hoses didn't snap under battlefield stress. When waterproof seals kept radios working through typhoons. When parachute boots stayed intact after landing behind enemy lines. When vehicle convoys could race forward without waiting for overseas cargo. Winning a war is rarely about the dramatic moment. It is about removing the moment of disaster before it ever happens. And that is exactly what rubber did. There's a reason the Marines called the Pacific Theater not a battlefield, but an enemy environment. You didn't just fight Japanese soldiers. You fought the jungle, the rot, the heat, and the slow death of exposure. In that kind of war, durability is weaponry. On Saipan, the Japanese tried to halt an American advance by blowing out supply trucks' tires with concealed metal traps and sharp coral. Natural rubber would have shredded. Synthetic rubber held. When an army keeps moving while the enemy expects it to choke, that is no longer a battle. That is psychological collapse. On Peleliu, flamethrower operators, already some of the most vulnerable men on the battlefield, survived ambushes because their hoses didn't rupture. Before the war, a single crack meant instant death by backdraft. Now, they kept firing. They kept clearing bunkers. The chemistry wasn't dramatic, but its consequences were. The Japanese expected time to be on their side. They thought shortages would drag the United States into fatigue. Instead, time became America's weapon. Every month of production was another nail in the coffin of resistance. Rubber wasn't just enabling the war, it was accelerating victory. By mid-1944, Japanese intelligence finally pieced it together. They saw supply speed increasing instead of slowing. They saw whole divisions equipped with fresh gear, while their own armies were patching tires with scraps of canvas. They realized the U.S. wasn't coping with the blockade. It had defeated the blockade itself. And here's the final irony. The United States defeated Japan's rubber strategy before the decisive battles of the Pacific were even fought. Rabaul, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, those weren't victories of the moment. They were victories already purchased in beakers back home. 2 years earlier, the world would only understand later that the war wasn't won on a map. It was won in a lab. In August 1945, as the guns finally fell silent and the last surrender documents were signed, America looked back on 4 years of impossible production. Fleets rebuilt, armies mobilized, oceans crossed, and buried deep inside that victory was a quiet truth. The entire U.S. war engine had been saved by a man the public still didn't know. His name was Dr. Waldo Seaman, a rubber chemist who was nearly fired for wasting time, who was laughed at for experimenting with chemical junk, and who stumbled onto synthetic rubber while everyone else insisted it couldn't be done. He didn't win medals. He didn't command divisions. He never stormed a beach. But millions of soldiers walked, drove, flew, and survived because of him. His invention didn't just give America tires. It gave them time. Time to reinforce, time to resupply, time to strike back. The Pacific wasn't just won by carriers and Marines. It was won by a material nobody could bomb, blockade, or burn. So the next time you see pool footage, the Higgins boats charging through surf, the bombers skimming runways, the endless American convoys snaking through jungle mud, remember, none of that moves without one obscure scientist and a crazy rubber trick the world thought was worthless. Sometimes, history's greatest heroes never held a rifle. Sometimes the battle is won by the person nobody saw coming. Before you click away, comment below, what country are you watching from? It helps me see how far these forgotten war stories travel. And if you want more powerful hidden war stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It really supports these long-form videos. Because this was just one chemist. And there are dozens more you've never heard of.